Disclaimer: this content is intended for mature audiences only. Viewer discretion is advised. I never thought I would be telling this story, let alone sharing it with the world. But there are moments in life when silence feels heavier than the truth, and this is one of them. It all started on an ordinary summer afternoon, the kind of day when the air feels lazy and time moves just a little slower. I was in the kitchen, sunlight pouring through the blinds, when I first noticed something in the way he looked at me. My stepson, Jake, had always been polite, reserved even. We shared the occasional conversation over dinner or in passing, but lately, something was different. His eyes lingered a second longer, his tone warmer, softer, almost careful, as if he was testing invisible boundaries neither of us had spoken about. At first, I brushed it off. Families can be complicated, and blending one is never easy. But over the following weeks, there was a shift I couldn't ignore. He started helping me with small things, fixing a shelf, carrying groceries, staying up late to chat when everyone else had gone to bed. I told myself it was harmless, that maybe we were just getting along better. But deep down, I felt an undercurrent, a pull I didn't want to acknowledge. It wasn't until that evening, when the house was quiet and the warm glow from the living room lamp wrapped around us, that I realized this wasn't just my imagination. We were sitting close, too close for comfort, talking about nothing in particular. And then there was a pause, the kind of pause where the silence feels electric, almost dangerous. I caught his gaze, and for a heartbeat, it was as if the air between us had thickened. My pulse quickened, my thoughts scattered, and I found myself wondering what exactly was happening here, and how far it might go if I didn't stop it. I know what you're probably thinking. How could something like this even cross my mind? Believe me, I asked myself the same thing. But sometimes life throws you into moments you never prepared for, moments where the lines between right and wrong blur in the dim light of connection and curiosity. This wasn't just about attraction. It was about the strange, unspoken understanding that was building between us, one shared glance at a time. There's a lot I'm still trying to make sense of, and maybe that's why I'm telling this story now. Because once that line was crossed, whether in words, actions, or simply in thought, everything changed. And the hardest part? I'm still not sure if it was a mistake, or something I secretly wanted. I guess to understand how things reached that point, you'd have to know a little more about how our lives ended up tangled together in the first place. When I married Mark 2 years ago, I knew he had a son from his first marriage. Jake was in his early 20s then, independent, busy with work and friends, and not home very often. I wasn't exactly a stepmom in the traditional sense. We didn't have that everyday interaction that most families do. But there was always a polite friendliness between us, a kind of mutual respect that made things easy. Mark and I had our own routines, and Jake was just a part of the background whenever he dropped by. But after Mark started traveling more for work earlier this year, Jake began showing up at the house more often, sometimes with a reason, sometimes just to check in. I didn't think much of it at first. I assumed he wanted company, or maybe he was making an effort to be closer since his dad was away so often. But the timing was interesting. Almost every visit happened when I was alone. He'd stay longer each time. Sometimes we'd talk about safe, casual things, movies, his work, the weather. Other times the conversations drifted into deeper waters, like dreams, regrets, and personal fears. I started to notice little details about him. The way his voice softened when he was speaking about something meaningful. The way he laughed when he thought no one else was listening. I tried to convince myself it was just me being overly aware, but every time our eyes met, there was this quiet intensity one couldn't quite name. It's strange, because I never set out to create any sort of closeness beyond what was appropriate. But the truth is, loneliness does strange things to a person. When Mark was gone for days at a time, the house felt empty. Conversations with Jake filled a void I didn't even realize was growing. There was a warmth there, a kind of attentiveness that I wasn't used to anymore. The shift became more noticeable one rainy afternoon. I was curled up on the couch with a book when Jake came in, shaking the water from his hair. He brought me coffee without me asking, sat down across from me, and we talked for what felt like hours. There was something about the sound of the rain and the dim light that made the moment feel almost too intimate. I caught myself smiling more than I should, listening a little too closely to the way he spoke. I kept telling myself these were just harmless moments, nothing more. But the more they happened, the harder it became to ignore the undercurrent. I started to wonder if he noticed it too, if he was feeling that same pull I was. And the more I tried to shake it off, the stronger it seemed to get. The weeks that followed felt like walking a tightrope. Every interaction between Jake and me carried an unspoken weight, and yet neither of us said anything about it. We danced around the line without ever acknowledging it existed, each small gesture adding another layer to the tension. Sometimes I caught him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking, and other times I found myself anticipating the sound of his car pulling up in the driveway. It was as if some invisible thread had been tied between us, pulling tighter with each passing day. Mark's business trips became longer, and with him gone, the quiet of the house only amplified the strange connection building between Jake and me. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was simply a side effect of too much time alone, but deep down I knew better. There was something real there, unspoken, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. One evening, the conflict inside me grew heavier than usual. Jake had offered to help fix a leak under the kitchen sink, and while he was working, we ended up talking about his childhood, his parents' divorce, and the way it had shaped him. There was vulnerability in his voice I hadn't heard before, and it made me see him in a different light, not just as Mark's son, but as his own person, with his own scars and quiet resilience. It was the kind of conversation that leaves you feeling closer without meaning to, but that's where the problem grew. Because every moment of closeness felt like a step towards something I couldn't take back. Part of me wanted to step away completely, to put more distance between us, but another part, one I didn't want to admit existed, was curious to see where this would lead. The subplot in all of this was Mark. He had no idea anything was different between Jake and me, but I started noticing subtle changes in our marriage. He seemed more distracted when we talked on the phone, more tired when he came home. Sometimes I wondered if he was hiding something of his own, and that thought only complicated the guilt I was already carrying. If Mark was drifting away from me, did that make what I was feeling less wrong, or even more dangerous? There was also the perspective from Jake's side that I couldn't ignore. Was this tension something he was fully aware of, or was I reading too much into it? Some days he seemed completely casual, just the same polite young man I had known before. But then there were moments, like when his hand brushed mine while passing me a cup of coffee, or when his eyes stayed on me a second too long, that told a different story. The truth was, I didn't know whose move it would be first, or if either of us would dare to make one. I only knew that the silence between us was starting to speak louder than words. It was late one Friday evening when the tension finally began to tip over into something neither of us could ignore. Mark had called earlier to say he'd be stuck out of town for the weekend. I told him it was fine, that I'd keep busy, but the moment I hung up the phone, I felt that strange mix of anticipation and unease settle over me again. Jake showed up not long after, saying he was in the neighborhood and thought he'd drop by. The night was unusually quiet, no TV, no music, just the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He lingered near the counter while I made tea, and we talked about small, harmless things, though neither of us seemed fully invested in the words. The pauses between sentences felt heavier, our eyes meeting more than they should. We ended up in the living room, sitting across from each other. The soft glow from the lamp threw shadows across his face, and for some reason, I couldn't look away. He was telling me about something at work, but I found myself watching the way his hands moved, the way his voice lowered when he was thinking. It wasn't what he was saying, it was everything else. The rain started sometime after that, tapping lightly against the windows. It added to the stillness, making the whole moment feel like it existed outside of time. I don't know who leaned in first, not physically, but in the way conversations shift when two people become more aware of each other than of anything else. There was an unspoken pull in the air, like we were both waiting for something to happen and afraid of it at the same time. My mind was racing with every reason why this was a bad idea, but my heartbeat refused to slow down. He noticed. I could tell by the way his expression shifted, a flicker of recognition passing between us. That's when a sound broke the moment. It was faint, coming from outside, a car door, maybe, or something moving in the driveway. We both froze, our eyes locked, the air suddenly heavier than before. Neither of us moved right away, as if we were caught between two realities, the one where we stepped back into safety and the one where we didn't. It wasn't Mark in the driveway. At least, not at first. When I peeked through the curtains, I saw a dark sedan idling under the streetlight, its engine humming softly in the rain. The windows were tinted, and for a second, I thought maybe it was just a neighbor or someone lost. But then the driver's door opened, and a tall figure stepped out, moving slowly toward the house. My pulse spiked, and when I glanced back at Jake, he was already standing, his shoulders tense. "I think that's Mom," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the shape outside. The words hit me like cold water. I had never met his mother in person, but I'd heard enough to know their relationship was complicated. She and Mark hadn't spoken in years except for brief, necessary updates about Jake. The thought of her showing up here unannounced on a night like this made my stomach twist. We didn't have time to decide what to do. A sharp knock rattled the front door, quick and insistent. The air between Jake and me, already heavy, now felt electric with a completely different kind of tension. He gave me a look that seemed to say, "Don't mention anything about earlier." Not that there was anything to say, really, but still. I opened the door to find a woman in her late 40s, rain dripping from her coat, her eyes sharp and searching. She didn't bother with small talk. "Is Mark here?" she asked, her voice low but firm. I explained he wasn't home, but she barely seemed to hear me. Her gaze flicked past me, landing on Jake. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone edged with suspicion. The question hung in the air like a blade. Jake stepped forward, his voice calm but guarded. "Nothing, Mom. Just visiting." But she didn't look convinced. Her eyes darted between us, lingering just long enough to make my skin prickle. It was as if she could sense something we hadn't even admitted to ourselves. She claimed she needed to talk to Mark urgently and that she'd wait inside. The three of us ended up in the living room, the rain tapping harder against the windows. I could feel her watching me, measuring every word I spoke, every glance I exchanged with Jake. And then she said something that changed everything. "You know," she began, leaning back in her chair, "I've been worried about how close you two have been getting." Her voice was casual, but the weight of the statement was anything but. People notice things, even if they don't say them out loud. The room went still. Jake shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. I tried to steady my voice as I asked what she meant, but she only gave a small, knowing smile, like she was testing us. That was when headlights swept across the window, and a familiar sound cut through the rain, the slam of Mark's truck door. He was home early. In that moment, my heart dropped. Whatever delicate balance had kept this quiet tension between Jake and me hidden was about to be shattered. And with both his mother and his father under the same roof, I knew there was no way we could keep pretending nothing was happening. Mark walked in, shaking the rain from his jacket, completely unaware of the storm waiting for him inside. His eyes lit up when he saw Jake, but then his expression shifted as he noticed his ex-wife sitting stiffly in the living room. The air turned dense, almost unbreathable. "What's going on?" he asked, looking between the three of us. His tone was calm, but there was an edge underneath it. His ex-wife didn't waste a second. "We need to talk," she said, her voice clipped. "About your wife and Jake." Mark's gaze swung to me, confusion etched across his face. My chest tightened, every possible outcome running through my mind. I opened my mouth to speak, but Jake stepped in first. "Mom's overreacting," he said firmly, his voice steady but low. "We've just been spending time together while you've been gone. That's all." But the way his mother's eyes flicked toward me told me she wasn't buying it. "You think I can't see it?" she said sharply. "The way you look at each other? People talk, Mark." I'm not the only one who's noticed. For a moment, no one moved. Mark's jaw tightened, and I could see the hurt and suspicion starting to surface. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I took a breath and said, "Mark, nothing happened. But yes, maybe we've gotten closer than we should have. That's the truth." The silence that followed was the longest few seconds of my life. Mark finally turned to Jake. "Is that true?" Jake's eyes met his father's, and something in his expression softened. "We crossed a line emotionally, Dad. But I wouldn't disrespect you like that." The words seemed to land like a weight between them. Mark looked away, his shoulders slumping slightly, and for a moment I thought the damage was done. But then his ex-wife spoke again, and her tone changed everything. "There's something else you need to know," she said, her voice quieter now. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded document. "Jake's not your biological son. I never told you because I didn't think it mattered, but maybe it does now." The room froze. Mark stared at her, disbelief written all over his face. Jake looked like someone had just pulled the ground out from under him. And me, I didn't even know how to process what I'd just heard. Whatever this connection between Jake and me was, the truth had just shifted the boundaries we thought existed. And in that instant, I realized the real question wasn't whether we'd crossed the line, but what that line even was anymore. Mark didn't say much after the truth came out. He just sat there, staring at the document in his hands while the rain outside softened to a gentle drizzle. The tension in the room shifted from confrontation to something heavier: shock, disbelief, and the weight of years of secrets. Jake looked torn between anger and relief, as though a lifetime of identity had just been rewritten in a single sentence. His mother avoided both their eyes, clearly regretting how and when she'd chosen to reveal the truth. When Mark finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "You'll always be my son," he said to Jake. "That doesn't change. But I need time to process all of this." Jake gave a small nod, his jaw tight. "I'm not going anywhere," he replied. "But I think I should give you both some space tonight." When he left, the house felt painfully still. I expected Mark to question me, to press for details about my connection with Jake, but instead, he just sighed and sank into the couch. "We've both been lonely," he said, not looking at me. "And I guess when people feel that way, they make connections they don't understand." It wasn't an accusation, it was an acknowledgement, one that somehow stung more than anger would have. Over the next few weeks, things slowly began to settle. Mark and I had long conversations, some difficult, some healing, about our marriage, about trust, and about the way distance, emotional and physical, had pulled us apart. Jake kept his visits brief, and while the warmth between us hadn't completely disappeared, it became something quieter, more respectful, like we both understood the need for boundaries. The biggest shift came when Jake decided to take a job offer in another city. He said it was for a fresh start, and I think we both knew it was the right choice. On his last day here, we stood in the driveway, rain clouds gathering above. "Thank you," he said softly, "for being honest with me, and for not letting it go too far." I smiled, though it was bittersweet. "Take care of yourself, Jake." As his car disappeared down the street, I realized the story had never been about crossing a line. It had been about recognizing it, and the choices you make when you find yourself standing on the edge. Viewers, what do you think? Did this ending surprise you, or did you see it coming? And would you want to see a sequel exploring what happens if Jake and I cross paths again in the future? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. Summary: a married woman and her adult stepson develop a slow, unspoken connection while her husband is away on frequent trips. As their emotional closeness grows, suspicion from the stepson's mother leads to a shocking revelation that he's not his stepfather's biological son. With the truth out, all three must navigate the blurred lines of family, trust, and the choices that define them. 35.